Okay. Alrighty. More prep. Welcome. More prep for the today's Wednesday the 14th. Office hours, and we're looking at Torkil Lausen's book on the long transition toward socialism and the end of capitalism. We're going to look at the conclusion because there's a lot more detail between, and uh, you can download the book for free, so you can go at it at your leisure. The conclusion is towards a strategy for the transition to socialism. In our last little episode, we did the intro and chapter one, where he talks about method. Now we'll look at sort of the closing of that set of ideas and conclusion towards a strategy for the transition to socialism. I'm not a utopian socialist. I cherish the socialist ideals, but I do not insist on immediate perfection. Nevertheless, we must progress towards realizing them. As I began working practically with third world liberation movements in the 1960s, I experienced the difference between ideals and the pragmatic compromises necessary for the everyday struggle. Practice leads to knowledge. Take, for example, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, which we supported in the 1970s and 80s. During this period, they gradually moved from a small, radical movement with a high revolutionary spirit to a more mature organization with a greater responsibility for the protection of Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria. Now, this forced them to compromise with non-socialist regimes like Lebanon and Syria. During the late 1970s onward, the PFLP developed close relations with the Soviet Union, which we considered a dubious ally. However, the Soviet Union was the only power which counterbalanced the US, the main ally of the Zionist occupation. Furthermore, the Soviet Union educated many PFLP members and offered practical material support. As we learned more about the dilemmas in the daily work of a revolutionary organization, we became less rigid in our evaluation of this cooperation. You may get dirty hands when you get work done. Indeed. The utopian socialists in the beginning of the 19th century used all their energy to paint an image of ideal socialisms, while the path towards realizing it remained hidden. Marx instead studied the real existing forces of capitalism to discover a path forward, to unite the wishes for a better world with a knowledge-based, realistic strategy based on existing conditions and social movements. That is, a concrete dream, which may be oxymoronic, but that's what he said. The strategies of transformation have to be realistic, but cannot be confused with reformism or reformism. They have to be based on the existing conditions. We must think of the struggle for socialism as practical politics in specific historical context, that is, political movements, institutions, and forms of praxis will reflect their unique conditions in the capitalist world system. The strategies and organizations used in the past 2 centuries are not necessarily effective today and in the future struggles. We must learn from history that there are no universal forms of struggle or organizational representations of socialist principles. The Paris Commune, the workers' councils in the German Revolution, the Soviet model of actually existing socialism, and the Cultural Revolution in China were all historically conditioned attempts at socialism. To attribute these historically specific forms of praxis to some kind of universality to gain support for immediate strategies is dangerous. The rejection of bureaucracy does not mean that planning is no longer part of socialism. On the contrary, planning economic decision making, politics dominating economics is essential for any form of socialism. We need a democratically constituted planned economy which can reconcile human needs with the reproduction of nature. In the global transformational process from capitalism to socialism, such a model has to take place within a state structure. Ideas of direct democracy, taken from anarchism and workers' councils, should be used within this state structure, as these ideas have failed to develop structures that have the necessary transformative power within world state systems. A rigid idealist and utopian perception of national and international struggles obscures the complexity and changeability of current class behaviors and interests. An anti-imperialist strategy must contain real, existing, counter-hegemonic forces capable of challenging the dominant power structure. It's not enough to wish for some socialist workers' movement to take state power from below if you cannot point to its real existence. This is like critical mass, right? Western Marxists have for long been trapped in a perception something got clipped here, and I can't figure out what it is, and it's probably my fault. In this way, Western Marxists have no real path towards socialism, only criticisms of the movements and states struggling to build socialism. And in that way, they are siding with capitalism. Footnote 1. On the left, there exists an idealist perception that the working and oppressed classes in pure emancipatory struggles must be the ones that accomplish the transition to socialism. And it is an idealist perception. The perception of the masses flushing out the old regimes by pouring into the streets in mass protests organized from below and general strikes are perceived as the only real revolution. As soon as they get more organized, assume state power, and exercise that power or relate to state powers, they somehow become sullied. So in this perception, revolutions turn into just one more oppressive regime, as in the case of the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, or Venezuela. However, in the transition process from capitalism to socialism, there's a close relation between the movements of the working and oppressed classes and the power of states in the world system. Take again the example of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. In its struggle, it had to take into account its relation to the Syrian and Lebanese states which hosted them, as well as the geopolitical struggle between the US, Soviet Union, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China. So if you insist on purity and ideals in relation to the state powers involved, you will not get far. A pure movement of workers and oppressed peoples does not exist as a transformative power. It appears in the complex interplay between economic and political contradictions. It appears in the complex interplay between economic and political contradictions in the world system. Now, why is China so important? Why do we put so much trust in China's role in the transformation from capitalism to socialism? Now, for one, political power is concentrated in the Communist Party. The Communist Party of China is one of the largest political management machines in human history, with more than 96.7 million members. Now, that's not a big number relative to the total population of the People's Republic of China, but it's sort of an interesting kind of number. Its organizational structure reaches every corner of the world's most populous country of more than 1.4 billion people. The survival and achievements of the party throughout 100 years indicates that it is in touch with the popular base. When defining the character of China, it's also possible to keep in mind that despite the influx of capitalism under Dangism, over 70% of workers are still self-employed or peasants or employed in non-capitalist enterprises and non-market-oriented public organizations, 70% of workers. Public ownership and control of finance, along with a hands-on approach to market regulations, ultimately left the economy, the central economy, in the hands of the state. The Communist Party has over 7 decades of demonstrable evidence that it can take and enact decisions on how to develop the world's largest nation. Its actions are not dependent on the will of millions of independent capitalists whose actions are guided by profit motives. China can carry out political decisions in accordance with plans and a vision which can change the world. Now, this is why China is important. The national state is the political and economic framework of the world system. This has been the model for the past several centuries and will persist in the end game. Thus, the transition towards socialism will partly be determined by the struggle between nation states. The nation state remains necessary as it provides essential security from the surrounding hostile world. During the transitional process, the socialist states will be on the defensive as long as capitalism dominates the world market and the politics of the world system. But the nature of the nation state and its ability to engage in the transition towards socialism will be determined by the class struggle. The strength of the state is dependent on a pro-people policy to secure the backing of the people. Now, in addition to this, it is of vital importance that the socialist-orientated states cooperate to achieve a critical mass of economic and political power to defy capitalism on the global level. Now, I'm aware of the criticism of both the former Soviet Union and current China for quote-unquote stateism. The development of an authoritarian state limits the freedom of any form of opposition. The state machinery has certainly not been withering away in states which have attempted to build socialism during the past 100 years. On the contrary, they have built strong states. Remember the differences between Lenin's writings on the matter of the socialist state in his text, State and Revolution, in August 1917, and the realities that led the Bolsheviks to build a quote-unquote strong state just a few months later. The discrepancy is not due to treason against the ideas of socialism, but the Lenin of August 1970 seemed to forget that the mission of the dictatorship of the proletariat is not limited to upholding internal national security. Tell that to the NKVD. There is also the question of the capitalist world system, which became evident with the intervention of the Allied imperialist forces during the Civil War in January 1918. Only strong states can offer the necessary protection against the hostile capitalist world while moving towards socialism. Only when global transition from capitalism to socialism has reached the turning point in which the socialist states are in the dominant position can the process of the withering away of the state take place. The attempt to build socialism inside capitalist society, the micro level, without state building, has a long history first associated with the traditions of cooperatives and anarchism, and later with the New Left collectives in the 1960s, autonomous movements and squatters collectives in the 1980s, and today with ecological attempts to build sustainable collectives. Now, Marx recognized cooperatives as a vital part of the labor movement. Empowering the workers is part of the wider struggle against capital. There is an increasing dialectic between the tasks of transforming oneself, one's immediate surroundings, and restructuring the larger society. This question is also related to the relationship between creating a socialist human being and transforming society discussed above. We're at once individual separate human beings and units of a collectivity on different levels. These levels are linked together in the individual, national, regional, and global levels. So, how do I relate to nature and other people, from my neighbor to the ones who produce my coffee and my smartphone? What do I eat? How do I transport myself? All these considerations have a global impact. These observations draw us back to a familiar argument. How can I change the world if I cannot change my own way of living? Let us start with ourselves. It also expresses a certain impatience with the abstract socialist agenda in general and suggests that we focus on transforming our immediate surroundings here and now rather than aiming at state power. I clipped something again. Break the capitalist system without aiming at state power. This is why China is important. Due to the level of its productive forces, China has the potential to be a game changer, which can tip the balance of the world system in favor of socialism. A multipolar world system representing 90% of humanity offers a better chance for global equality and a way out of the climate crisis than the privileged 10% that is North America and Western Europe. A multipolar world might also be a world with the best chances for social transformation. China has become the principal force in the effort to establish a multipolar world system and a new international economic order not dominated by the Bretton Woods financial institution and the dollar, the US dollar, as the world currency. Now, this is the reason why the development of socialism with Chinese characteristics becomes crucial, not only for China, but also for other nations breaking with capitalism. Now, this is what Samir Amin calls the strategy of disconnection in a polycentric world system. Countries in the global south that want to de-link from global capitalism and develop socialism or are under sanctions from the US stand in a better position today than during the Cold War. In the 1970s, the Third World demanded a quote-unquote new world order, which came to nothing. Today, the global south is creating a new world order. So instead of centuries of exploitative north-south relations, we see instead the emergence of mutually beneficial south-south investment, south-south investment, trade, and political relations. Today, it is within the capacity of the global south to de-link and cut the pipelines of imperialism if they have the commitment. China can push for a multipolar world order from a position of strength. It can give material and diplomatic support to countries in the global south that are facing the US, much like the Soviet Union once did, but with greater resources at its disposal. The monopoly of global financial institutions, technology, and a science held by the West is broken. Anti-imperialism, past and present. Now, anti-imperialism today is not, cannot be the same as in the long 1960s, that is 1955 to 75. History does not repeat itself. It just merely moves forward. The high revolutionary spirit and the success of the anti-colonial struggle from the late 1940s until the mid-1970s were due to a combination of contradictions in the world system at the time. Now, this contradiction was between the socialist bloc, the second world, and the US, as well as the contradiction between the emergence of the third world on one side and the US trying to implement neo-colonialism on the other, see Vietnam. There was an intense wish in the third world to get out of the grip of the West, reflected in the Bandung Conference in 1955 and the formation of the non-alignment movement. Now, this set of interlinked global contradictions opened up the wave of anti-imperialist liberation struggles with a socialist perspective across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. All this changed with a counteroffensive of imperialism beginning in the mid-1970s, which revitalized capitalism for decades. However, neoliberal globalization was not the end of history. The changes in the international division of labor produced the decline of US hegemony. This is globalization, right? The decline of US hegemony and the rise of China, together with the other BRICS members, BRICS members in the world economy, and promoted a multipolar world system. The BRICS cooperation between Brazil, India, Russia, and South Africa was founded in 2009 as a result of the financial crises in 2006 to 7, which revealed the weakness of Western financial institutions. In September 2023, it was enlarged to include Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. BRICS now comprises 46% of the world's population and 32% of the world economy. Its future prospects of growth outweigh those of the G7. The BRICS countries pursue individual strategies to enhance their economic and political, regional, and world position as US hegemony declines. In that effort, they're at odds with the current rules of the global economy established to ensure the flow of value to the centers of imperialism. At the same time, they are in need of capital to develop their productive forces. However, to get access to financial resources, they find that the IMF and the World Bank require that they open their economies to the interests of the West. The trade of the global South is carried out in dollars. Investments are in dollars. Reserves are held in dollars. Their debt is to be in dollars. The BRICS are subject to dollar hegemony. Instead of this, they want to work together to take advantage of complementarities in each other's production and markets to trade and invest amongst themselves for mutual benefit in order to break the unequal north-south structure of finance and trade. They cannot pursue that strategy on their own, but acting together, they can begin to challenge the rules-based international order of the imperialist system. BRICS is not an anti-capitalist or socialist organization. It is simply an organization trying to create an alternative and fairer, quote unquote, system of finance and trade. Following the BRICS Plus Summit in September 2023, 30 heads of state and representatives from the G77 plus China group met in Cuba and stressed the urgent need for a comprehensive reform of the international financial architecture. Footnote 6. Now, once again, this does not mean that BRICS is anti-capitalist, clearly, and members like Russia are for sure repressive regimes. India is participating in the military alliance Quad, together with the US, Japan, India, and Australia, directed against China. Iran kills communists and are brutally suppressing women. as we've seen recently. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are exploiting southern migration labor in the most extreme way. How can this project be progressive? The emerging multipolar world system consists of a complex of contradictory currents between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic capitalist and socialist forces. The challenge is to navigate these interconnected struggles in the world system. This is what China tries to do, encouraging anti-hegemonic movements among states in the global south, with the BRICS as a significant support. The lesson from the Chinese revolutionary process was that a rigid view of class relations can obscure the complexity and changeability of class behaviors and interests, and that the conditions for revolution need to be understood in assessing the overall situation and identifying, as we mentioned before, the principal contradiction, footnote 7. In the anti-imperialist struggle against Japan, the communists were allied with the national bourgeois Kuomintang. The newborn People's Republic in 1949 adopted the quote-unquote new democracy concept, which included the national bourgeoisie. And I think you can argue that this, this remains underlying some ideas. Anyway, according to Mao, the revolutionary advance went through stages, moving first against the international bourgeoisie to clear the path for national development with the help of capital, and through this, quote, dealing unrelenting blows to imperialism, close quote, it served to clear a path even wider for socialism. One can see China's current international strategy as, quote unquote, new democracy played out on the global level, like the national bourgeoisie in China, Modi in India, or the Saudi King Salman may be unreliable, clearly, and fall under the influence of U.S., see Kushner, but they should be seen as possible allies with China, helping to weaken the U.S. hegemonic grip, and develop the productive forces in the global south to prepare the ground for future socialist advances. We'll see about that. A decline in U.S. hegemony will furthermore provide more space for working and oppressed classes to move ahead in their struggles towards socialism. We should support the struggles against oppression and exploitation in any BRICS country, whether the current rulers like it or not, as it will strengthen the socialist trend in the global south. The current phase in the world system is undermining the United States' hegemonic grip and thereby providing the ground for a socialist transition within this century. The failure to grasp this is to misread the potential of the situation, with momentum gathering in the global south and pressure mounting for more international cooperation. States outside the imperialist triad of the United States/Canada, Europe, and Japan, comprising more than 80% of the global population, have refused to join the West's sanctions against Russia. Hence Shadow Fleet, right? Similarly, most countries in the global south are opposed to the U.S.'s aggressive policy towards China. The war in Gaza and the U.S. drive to maintain control over the Middle East through the settler colonial state of Israel has further undermined the credibility of the West, increasing discourse on democracy, human rights, and a rule-based world system. Like in the 1960s, the contradiction between the West trying to uphold its hegemony and the rest resisting it this contradiction can create space for movements struggling for socialism and open opportunities for nations wishing to develop socialism. The development of the productive forces in the global south in the past several decades has placed them in a much better position to move towards socialism than during the 1960s. The West does not have a monopoly on high-tech development any longer. They do not dominate global trade because the rest has been expanding south-south development and trade. Now, on the surface, the ideological struggle between China and the US is different from the 1960s. The US is not talking about the struggle against communism, but quote unquote liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. Well, not so much these days. And China is not talking about the socialist world revolution, but the establishment of a multipolar world system. Now, in the 1960s, China had an explicitly communist, anti-imperialist policy supporting revolutionary movements around the world. Currently, Chinese foreign policy is pragmatic with an emphasis of non-interference in other states. Now, China has a reason for this pragmatism. It wants to build socialism with Chinese characteristics in a calm international atmosphere. It no longer believes it would be effective to stamp its version of socialism on other movements and countries. Instead, China encourages them to develop socialism in accordance with their own national characteristics. Now, however, this policy is still a threat to the accumulation of global capital, and as such, is still a class-based anti-imperialist struggle, even though the ideological tone is turned down. Now, during the 1960s, it was European colonial powers and the US versus the Third World. Today, it is the same imperialist powers versus the global South. The North is still the dominant aspect, but the South is again on the offensive. Well, the transformative power of the Third World in the 1960s was based on the quote unquote revolutionary spirit. The attempt at ideological dominance over economic development, the current transformative power of the global South, in particular China, is based on its economic strength. As the totality of the relations of production, this is a much better position for the future struggle. Footnote 10. So, how should we, as anti-imperialists in the capitalist center, deal with the contradiction between declining US hegemony and a multipolar world system? We need a balanced approach. We must support the Chinese peasants and workers in their class struggle to move society towards socialism. I believe this struggle is possible within the current political framework, as the Communist Party has been moving steadily to the left in the past decade. If one chooses to support a struggle for socialism against the Communist Party, one must be very sure that the critique is from the left and not a liberal, democratic, pro-capitalist movement which will serve the interests of upholding U.S. hegemony. See Walmart. On the other hand, anti-imperialists must defend China against US-led imperialism, just as the Soviet Union balanced imperialism, which made decolonization possible. China is today the only power that can balance the US, which is a prerequisite for strengthening the anti-imperialist struggle globally. A strong and socialist China can be of decisive importance for a global transformation from capitalism to socialism, and will be necessary to avoid the collapse of the system into a chaotic abyss. Next section, nationalism and internationalism. Internationalism is of strategic interest because the realization of socialism has to involve the majority of the world system. We need to unite internationally to make multipolarity possible and provide this new world order with a socialist content. However, it is difficult to foster internationalist solidarity within a world system in which The working class live under very different circumstances and are struggling not only against national capitalism, but against the exploitation of one nation by another. Anti-imperialism must be an integrated part of the national struggle, not only in words, but also in deeds. One may rigidly focus and engage in community level struggles, but without prioritizing anti-imperialism and taking the global perspective, the struggle fragments, and the achievements in one part may undermine the advance of the whole. The primary revolutionary actor of the coming decades will be the proletariat of the global South. Given the globalization of production, it has the potential to develop a global perspective. Its struggle cannot succeed if it remains confined to nation-state boundaries. Now, this would only create a race to the bottom between the national working classes. There is a place for national tactics and strategies, but they must be embedded in international organizing. If industrial workers organize along the transnational production chains, they can achieve more strength than only organizing along national lines. The logistics of globalized capitalism depend on the workers in container transport, harbors, and airports. They could block the system if they choose. In the global South, the peasants are still the largest class, comprising about 60% of the population. The growing importance of eco-socialist struggle is foreshadowed by peasant movements, including the Landless Workers Movement, the MST in Brazil, the International Peasants Alliance, La Via Campesina, the Farmers' Revolt in India, and China's Rural Reconstruction Movement. The ecological aspect is also the focus of indigenous people struggles throughout the Americas. These movements are finding ways to unite with worker struggles and call for a new international of workers and people. Footnote 11. Indigenous resistance is an important inspiration in the environmental proletarian revolt as they take a global perspective. As Nick Estes writes, quote, there is a capaciousness to indigenous kinship that goes beyond the human. Whereas past revolutionary struggles have strived for the emancipation of labor from capital, we are challenged not just to imagine, but to demand the emancipation of the earth from capital. For the earth to live, capitalism must die. So in the absence of a communist international, we need to at least support a transnational anti-systemic movement. So how do we organize such a movement? Now, it can be done here and now, starting with creating a network through which participants could share resources, experiences, and information, coordinate protests, strikes, and actions, mobilize solidarity and support. In short, organizationally erase the boundaries between isolated struggles and connect them into one common struggle. Now, the specific areas of the transnational struggle can be multiple. The international trade union struggle across global commodity chains, transnational climate and ecological struggles, movements against imperialist war, anti-racist, anti-fascist, and anti-colonial struggles, the global movement for basic living conditions, etc. Now, from the times of the Communist Manifesto onward, it was understood that the only way to implement socialism was a world revolution. Lenin believed that the Russian Revolution could only survive if revolutions in the most advanced capitalist countries would follow. Likewise, China hoped that the revolutionary spirit in the long 1960s, remember 1955 to 1975, would draw the Chinese socialist project out of its isolation. However, nationalism had a stronger appeal in Europe, where social democratic parties identified the interests of the working class with the interests of the nation. And eventually, nationalist sentiments grew strong in the Soviet Union as well. Nationalism was also a key factor in Third World liberation struggles. In fighting for their political independence, oppressed nations pitted a progressive nationalism against the reactionary nationalism of the imperialist nations. And the failed attempt to develop the national liberation struggle into an economic liberation from imperialism by establishing socialist states in the Third World during the long 1960s, together with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Chinese opening to neoliberalism, right? Dongism, one might call it, proved Marx and Engels' statement in the manifesto right or correct. Even if some kind of socialist transition would occur in one country within a dominating capitalist world system, it would still be part of the global division of labor, transnational production chains, and would have to compete in the global market. Now, this can only lead to the implementation of exploitative practices that benefit the capitalist world economy, as we have seen in China. This requires us to return to socialism's global ambition, the only realistic one. The principal contradiction in the world system determines, to a large extent, the outcome of national and local struggles. While we cannot ignore the political reality of nation states, our strategy must be a global one. The national struggle should contribute to moving the principal contradiction of the world systems in the right direction. Socialism can only flourish when it becomes the dominant mode of production globally. Now, to achieve this situation, the struggle for socialism has to develop from movements, parties, and other kinds of organizations to govern states. The socialist state can begin to develop a mode of production on the national level, but as importantly, they can support the struggle for socialism within the entire world system. The existence of actually existing socialism, with all its flaws, secured a balance of power with U.S. imperialism, which made other struggles for socialism possible. The existence of the Soviet Union contributed to the victory of China, Vietnam, and the survival of the Cuban Revolution, which itself was important for struggles in Angola, Bolivia, the Congo, and more, Venezuela, Nicaragua. For today, a socialist-oriented China can be of great importance for a possible transition towards global socialism. China should not be so isolated and forced to retreat into nationalism, but take part in the international struggle for the global transition to socialism. Besides internationalism, the struggle has to have a radical anti-capitalist perspective. There's no social democratic road to socialism. Social democracy is a mutation of socialism generated by imperialism and can only prosper in the global north as a capitalist welfare state. If reforms in the global north are not accompanied by the deconstruction of imperialism, then they are not a step forward. They are parasitic. If reforms in the global north are not accompanied by the deconstruction of imperialism, then they're not a step forward. They're parasitic. Time is running out for reforms. The capitalist mode of production threatens the balance of the global ecosystem. We do not have all the time in the world. None of us do. climate change and the transition towards socialism. Capitalism, especially the past 50 years of neoliberal globalization, has created serious environmental problems. This has already affected the living conditions of millions of people in the global south and led to the formation of movements for a radical change. The global north is trying to reduce global warming without significantly changing the lifestyle that is causing global warming. So as usual, capitalism assimilates critique and is now developing quote unquote green capitalism. Hence all this greenwashing, right? Which innovates new products and grows in parallel with continuing fossil capitalism. Green capitalism is a contradiction in terms. The competition between capital and states within the world systems forces each capitalist and each state to expand capital accumulation. The current conflict level in the world system reinforced this competition, and the prospect of reaching international agreements that would diminish global warming seemed to have vanished. Clean coal, stopping wind development, wind power farms, etc. Alternatively, there should be an economic system based on the social ownership of the means of production, which makes political decisions that control how and what to produce. So instead of using surplus products for extended capital accumulation, they can be used for decarbonization, environmental cleaning, or projects to reduce inequality. The climate movement sometimes tends to view the environment and climate as issues separate from class relations, yet climate change is connected to capitalism and imperialism and is therefore class related. Citizens in the global north are able to mindlessly consume the globe's resources and throw out the trash only because the rest of the world cannot. The climate struggle must be linked to the development of an equal world. It's not possible to raise the living standards of billions of poor people in the global south to the level of the US or Germany within the capitalist mode of production due to the simple lack of natural resources. To accommodate their needs, it's not only a change in the relations of production and patterns of consumption, which is needed to develop socialism on a global scale, it is also a continued development of the productive forces. Continued development of the productive forces. On this, Emmanuel writes, quote, steel, aluminum or aluminium, and copper, of which the masses of the center consume today in such extravagant quantities, do not serve only to produce automobiles and gadgets. They produce doctors or books as well. It takes a tremendous amount of steel, cement, and energy to produce a doctor or a school or a village. A global and sustainable socialism cannot be developed by underdeveloping technology. It needs the most advanced forms of technology, period. The ruling class cannot and will not save the environment. Instead of pleading with rulers, we need to anchor our understanding of the climate crisis in class analysis. Without the mobilization of the proletariat and peasants, there is no abolition of capitalism and thus no social, ecological transformation of society. The global scale of the climate crisis must be countered by centralized and global planning, which presupposes a global transformation towards socialism. The global movement for socialism must include environmental struggles, while environmental movements must equally take on a class and global perspective. John Bellamy Foster writes, quote, hundreds of millions of people have now entered actively into the struggle for a world of substantive equality and ecological sustainability, constituting the fundamental meaning of socialism and the future of history in our time. Yet, the planetary revolt of humanity in the 21st century will prove, quote unquote, irresistible and irreversible, and thus succeed against all odds only if it takes the form of a more unified, revolutionary human subject emanating from the wretched of the earth and environmental proletariat. It is time to exit the burning house. I may only need to construct a new house as opposed to the burning house. Instead of appeals to the capitalist state to act sensible in terms of climate change, the struggle has to go through the establishment of pro-socialist states. And in terms of transition, we are running out of time due to our climate problems. The end game. The end game will be characterized by intense and sometimes chaotic fluctuations. Today, capitalism is in crisis. An economic crisis aggravated by the erosion and split up of the world market and wars. The crisis is ecological. Scientific studies tell us that we're heading towards catastrophe in the form of natural disasters, storms, floods, droughts, and shrinking harvests. Scientific studies tell us that we are heading towards catastrophe in the form of natural disasters, storms, floods, droughts, and shrinking harvests, a development that is increasing migration and exacerbating the economic crisis. There's political crisis because the bourgeoisie is divided between those who wish to resume neoliberal globalization, that is, change everything to keep everything the same, and paleoconservative factions who want to return to a nation-based accumulation of capital, authoritarian rule, and warfare to secure the lion's share of the global spoils. See Greenland. The split in the bourgeoisie continues down the road, down through the middle class and the working class in the global north, between groups linked to transnational capital and groups linked to national sectors. New national conservative alliances arise. The Trump-dominated Republican Party in the United States, 10 years of this, together with the right populism throughout Europe, are all signs of this split and the confusion it causes. The old politicians in the global north are desperately seeking to overcome the gap between the need for transnational capital, for continued neoliberal globalization, and a growing desire of the electorate to return to the capitalist nation-based welfare state. It's a difficult task. Production and consumption have become globalized. You cannot just dismantle the transnational production chain without a serious loss of profit for capital. Now, based on the evaluation of the past and present, the following is a possible scenario for the following decades. U.S. hegemony is in decline. The U.S. has lost its economic superiority, its political elite is divided, and there is no revival of the American century. China is on the rise. It will continue its development of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Externally, it will pursue the establishment of a multipolar world system. Professor Cheng Yao-wen from the School of International Relations and Public Affairs in Shanghai has reintroduced the strategy of the encirclement of the cities from the countryside as part of China's foreign policy. This is an interesting idea, and with all due respect, this is kind of inverting sprawl. Let's put it that way. I think you can have a whole theory of that. 100 years ago, quote, 100 years ago, the leaders of the Communist Party of China proposed the revolutionary path of encircling the city in the countryside. At this time of unprecedented changes, China and the developing countries need to break the center-periphery order of the contemporary world and the Western countries' prevention and suppression of non-Western countries, as well as to improve solidarity and cooperation in the global rural areas. The Belt and Road Initiative was launched in 2013. By February 2022, 146 countries have signed up to join the initiative. In combination with BRICS, China will create South-South and East-West relations to change the old North-South structure of the world system. There is a wish in many countries in the global South to change the U.S. dollar-centered international financial system for several reasons. Due to its hegemonic position, the U.S. had the exorbitant privilege of printing dollars to be used as world money for exchange, dollars which never return to the U.S. for claiming goods. The U.S. also uses the status of the dollar as world money and international financial architecture to sanction countries as trading dominated in dollars has to transit through a U.S. bank and the SWIFT system, the SWIFT system. A change to this will further weaken U.S. hegemony, which depends on these structures. I'd add the BIS to that, but anyway. A multipolar world system, alternative economic institutions, and the existence of a major technologically developed state, China, will provide space for social movements and states in the global South to move in the direction of socialism. We may see the development of a different kind of socialism incorporating the historical and cultural background of each nation. These movements and states will intensify their cooperation. These movements and states will intensify their cooperation, tipping the balance in the world system from capitalism towards the direction of socialism. Socialist advances will originate in the global South, where the popular forces understand that it's not possible to turn the development of the productive forces into a system that benefits the people without a transformation from capitalist to socialist relations of production. These struggles are necessarily arising in specific contexts, embodying environmental as well as economic and cultural realities. They will develop not just socialism with Chinese characteristics, but socialism with South African characteristics, Brazilian characteristics, and Palestinian characteristics. This is not just a tribute to diversity. Diversity is necessary for success in developing socialism in different contexts. As global capitalism begins to collapse, the immediate concern for future socialist socialist governments, the immediate concern for future socialist governments in the global South will be how to organize the economy to meet people's basic needs without worsening the ecological crisis. See Brazil. In this transitional period, future socialist orientated governments may again take up this strategy of delinking from the remains of the capitalist world market and its law of value. In this transitional period, future socialist-orientated governments may again take up the strategy of delinking from the remains of the capitalist world market and its law of value. The strategy of delinking would help socialist governments to establish a state monopoly over domestic markets and reduce the pressure from the capitalist world market. The establishment of an international alternative to the capitalist financial system and its dollar tyranny will also improve the maneuvering space for socialist governments to socialize the economy and implement socially and environmentally progressive policies. They will face the task of cleaning up the global environment and developing new ways to produce and consume, which will lead to long-term sustainability. We're at the threshold of decisive struggles. We are at the threshold of decisive struggles. The transition from capitalism to another mode of production can take two qualitatively different forms. The first form is an uncontrolled implosion of capitalism into ecological and political chaos, sort of what we're doing now. The second is a transition in which the strategy of the struggling classes captures the reality of the situation and solves the contradiction to unblock development of the productive forces. Now, in this case, we have a transition with a clear vision. However, socialism is not predetermined to follow after capitalism, as the more mechanical rendition of dialectical materialism suggests. Yes, indeed. It is not a given fact that there is a happy ending, even with Jeffrey Epstein. The crisis of capitalism makes objective conditions for change excellent. In a structural crisis where the system is unstable, the agent, quote unquote, plays a decisive role. The problem is the development of the subjective forces for change. We were too optimistic in the 1970s. However, I believe that we are too defensive and pessimistic today. In the introduction, recall the introduction that we did yesterday, I pointed out that without anger and a burning desire to change the world, it is not possible to mobilize the forces that will create radical change. This anger exists as spontaneous uprisings across the globe signify. The problem is the strategy that can turn these feelings from the streets into socialist transformation. The pessimism in the mainstream left is understandable given previous failures, but pessimism gets in the way of revolutionary hope. Quote, capitalism survives every crisis, unquote. Quote, all attempts to establish socialism have ended in disaster, unquote, and so forth. The result is a cynical, toothless critique of capitalism without a perspective of radical change. Therefore, I choose to be an optimist. This choice is part of the ideological struggle, both within the left and against the capitalist system. When I say optimism, I do not mean naivete or naivety. It is not simply a matter of time until the quote unquote masses get it right. What I mean is realistic optimism, taking into account the structural crises and instability of global capitalism, as well as the hundreds of millions of new proletarians in the global south who have, quote, nothing to lose but their chains, close quote, and are becoming ever more conscious of their power. The development of the productive forces in the global south places the working class in a central position and creates a much stronger foundation for the development of the socialist society than was the case in the decolonization era. So, even if the brand of socialism is damaged by the many failed attempts and the mixed experiences of quote unquote actually existing socialism, I think, that is, the author thinks, socialism has a chance to replace capitalism simply because it has a core of rationality, and it does, which is needed to solve the problems confronting humanity. Next section. What is to be done? This is what Lenin said. Support a multipolar world system against U.S. hegemony to promote a more peaceful and democratic world with an empowered and reformed United Nations. Gee, what a novel idea. Support the global South struggle for a more equal world against the West, which have ruled the world through colonialism and imperialism for the last 500 years. Support the countries and movements developing socialism to end the exploitation of humans and the destruction of planet Earth. And what specifically can the left in the global North do? After all, we won't be the driving force in the transition towards global socialism. However, it's not enough to wait for the proletariat of the global South to create a revolutionary situation in our part of the world. We must be more than passive bystanders. We must make sure that the North is no safe hinterland for imperialism, which means struggle against right-wing national chauvinism, racism, and imperialist political and military intervention. Anti-war campaigns will be an essential part of anti-imperialism in the coming years. We will be considered national traitors, but that's better than being class traitors. But hasn't that always been the case? Anyway, we must support socialist movements and states, not only in words, but in deeds and material means. To the extent possible, we should promote worker struggles along the global production chains. Promote worker struggles along the global production chains. We must build an international climate and solidarity organization, the specific ways and which mean to use in the struggle and which means to use in the struggle depend on the type of organization and the specific political situation in place. It'll range from mass movements to direct action groups, from parliamentary work and civilian disobedience to, yes, armed struggle. We will be a minority, but an important minority. In our political work, we often feel that what we're doing is too little, unimportant in terms of changing the world. However, there are no small struggles, no small resistances. There are separate sets of actions and interventions that sometimes converge to force big changes. The capitalist system is out of balance. Small actions can produce an avalanche of events. We should keep in mind that revolution is not a tea party. Never been a tea party or a dinner party. Capitalism will not just lay down. If our struggle is more than words, it will have consequences. We should plan and be prepared for this on the personal and the organizational level. On a personal level, it is not easy to be at odds not only with the state, but also mainstream society. There are strong forces which aim to integrate us into the system, our imperial way of living. Our participation in the real estate market and our pension funds link us to the well-being of capitalism. The massive news media and cultural influences inject the norms and values of liberal capitalism into our body and soul. It can be difficult to maintain a clear-cut opposition to the system and accept that deep economic and political crises are part of the end game of capitalism. Deep economic and political crises are part of the end game of capitalism, and we should welcome it. The end game is not a walk in the park. On an organizational level, we will have to prepare for how the global struggle will develop in the next 2 to 5 years. What should our strategy be? How can I and my organization fit into the analysis of the objective and subjective forces of transition? What kind of support can we deliver? How can we best be a cogwheel in the big machine of transformation from world capitalism towards socialism? Next section. And there will come a day. Let me end this long book as I began, on a personal note. I wish to paraphrase the handbill There will come a day, handed out in May 1968 at Burmeister and Wain's shipyard in Copenhagen. A text that in many ways set the course for my political trajectory. This is the author's political trajectory. The handle states that the mobilization and transformation of the working class in the capitalist metropolis into a revolutionary force requires a crisis. And the working class needs to realize that radical change is necessary. Only then can we undertake struggles for emancipation. Lenin said, quote, revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis affecting both the exploited and the exploiters. It follows that for revolution to take place, it is essential first that a majority of the workers, or at least a majority of the class conscious, thinking, and politically active workers, whether that's a vanguard is another question, should fully realize that revolution is necessary and that they should be prepared to die for it. Close quote. Unless blindfolded by illusions or dogmatism, no one will maintain that the majority of the working class of the global north is prepared to die for the socialist revolution. Rather, the majority are prepared, if not to die, then to struggle to defend their imperial mode of living. See the professional managerial class. This has been the case since the end of the Second World War, and it'll be like this for some time to come. How will the global north working class react when, because of the struggle for the emancipation of the oppressed nations and people, the imperial mode of living is just no longer possible? We have seen racism and right-wing populism spreading in Europe and North America in the past decades. When the middle class comes under pressure, it often moves to the right, and social democrats have a historical record of allying with capital during crises. Now, this might lead to military intervention against emerging socialism in the global south, see Venezuela, see Cuba, in an effort to reconstruct imperialist dominations. Seldom has someone hit the bullseye better than Lenin when he wrote, quote, there in the West, the craft union, narrow-minded, selfish, case-hardened, covetous, and petty bourgeois labor aristocracy, imperialist-minded and imperialist corrupted, has developed, close quote. Now, how has this come about? Now, the answer is as Engels wrote, that the northern workers, quote, have gladly taken their share of the booty, close quote, from the exploitation of colonized people. The British Prime Minister Disraeli, who was a champion of imperialism and defended the right of the quote unquote superior races to subjugate inferior ones, extended suffrage to the popular classes in Britain in exchange for their support for colonial expansion. That's the trade-off in the mid-19th century. In this way, he diffused the social question and class struggle in his own country. Quote, I say with confidence that the great body of the working class of England are English to the core. They are for maintaining the greatness of the kingdom and the empire, and they are proud of being subjects of our sovereign and members of such an empire, close quote. The popular masses respond to the dominant class's social reforms with patriotism and support for colonial expansionism. Losurdo, recall we've been looking at Losurdo, right? Writes, quote, however progressive in itself, there is no class struggle that cannot be instrumentalized by the dominant power and integrated into a general prospect of a conservative or reactionary stamp. This is not a new phenomenon, but it has been accentuated and acquired a new qualitative potency in the wake of disenchantment at the result of 20th century revolutions and subsequent theoretical disorientation, close quote, see Western Marxism. Marx and Engels pointed to the connection between social reform and colonialism. Lenin extended the critique, but the Social Democratic and Communist parties of Western Europe kept silent about it. So, what have the Social Democrats done instead? They've been working for reforms for shorter working hours, longer holidays, bigger unemployment subsidies, etc. What have the communists been doing? They have raised demands for still higher wages, still longer holidays, still bigger unemployment subsidies, etc. The Social Democrats have been boasting of the results achieved. The communists have been saying that these results were simply too small. They are wrong. Imperial socialism will not lead to socialism. Well, Lenin explained why. Quote, only the proletarian class, which maintains the whole of society, can bring about the social revolution. However, as a result of the extensive colonial policy, the European proletariat partly finds himself in a position. The European proletarian partly finds himself in a position where it is not his labor, but the labor of the practically enslaved natives in the colonies that maintains the whole of society. In certain countries, this provides the material and economic basis for infecting the proletariat with colonial chauvinism. See, Walmart or whatever. Social Democrats and communists have been joining hands in making the workers believe that it's the working class itself, through class struggle, that has made the welfare state possible. It is, but it is also based on imperialism. Lenin called it a parasite state. However, it's not important to remember. It is important to remember that the parasite state theory is not only a state that the working class gains from imperialism. The bourgeoisification was a historical phenomenon created by specific historical, economic, and political developments in capitalism. And since it is a historical phenomenon, it opened up the possibility of change in the position of the class. The parasite state theory states that the working class in Western Europe and North America occupies a dual position. They're an object of exploitation as they perform wage labor, which creates surplus value and thus profit for capital. However, by virtue of their relatively high wages, they are also able to acquire value through their consumption of goods produced by low-wage labor in the global South, whether they are exploited or exploiter in a global perspective. It is a matter of a balance between the acquisition of value, that is through consumption, exploitation, and then their contributions of surplus value to capital. So, without this double perspective on the position of the working class, the parasite state theory becomes static and loses its revolutionary content. This theory can explain both the historical process of bourgeoisification and the working class's support for colonialism and imperialism through the 20th century. At the same time, it also maintains the future possibility of this class as the grave diggers of capitalism. So if one denies the significance and consequences of imperialism's transfusion of value to the working class in the global North, one fails or falls into the fog. One falls into the fog of seeing every economic struggle as a revolutionary struggle on the road to socialism. So, if one denies that the highly paid worker in the imperialist countries produces value, surplus value, and profit, then you reject the possibility that the working class in the imperialist center can ever play a role in the struggle against capitalism. Moreover, one loses sight of political activity in the global North and gives up the task set by Lenin, quote, to be able to seek, find, and correctly determine the specific path or the particular form or the particular turn of events that will lead the masses to the real decisive and final revolutionary struggle, such is the main objective of communism in Western Europe and in America today. Close quote. Footnote 27. The hallmark of a Marxist is to have an analysis, strategy, and praxis for the context in which one is situated. The communists in the global north must include the anti-imperialist struggle and thereby the struggle against their own state's imperialism as a centerpiece in their strategy. The success of this task depends on their courage, and their fighting spirit, on how deep into the quagmire of chauvinism and imperialism the working class can do battle. When imperialism is defeated in the global south and the working class in the center once again faces only their own bourgeoisie, then they may overthrow the exploiters. Global socialism, the only possible socialism, needs intervention from both North and South. The new world order will emerge from fiery struggles. The stakes are high. Will the system self-destruct by catastrophe? Will we slide further into global apartheid under fascist rule? Or will strong anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist movements emerge? Well, we close with that question. We've got to the end of the conclusion, so to speak. I think you can see where he's coming from. So what we've been looking at is the introduction and the conclusion chapters of Torkil Lausen's The Long Transition Towards Socialism and the End of Capitalism. And he covers in the space between these two things how this kind of idea, the idea of the transition towards socialism, has sort of manifest itself. And in many ways, we have to come back to the issue of we have to come back to, what is correct action, what is to be done. So anyway, you can see these are the chapters in Lausen's book, part 1, part 2. We didn't look at that. We didn't even look at part 3 of the transition, historical lessons and transition in to socialism. And he, needless to say, he puts in time on Stalinism, preceded by the Third International, the Chinese Revolution, the Third World on the Rise, the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, and the USSR, the post 1956 to 1990, the end of actually existing socialists. So the point of Khrushchev's speech, pretty important in 56, and occurring on the sort of the tail end of Bandung, etc. So the Chinese encounter with neoliberal globalization is kind of where we are, and Xi Jinping thought whatever. So that's kind of where we are. It's a very current set of questions and promises, and I think there are certain good ideas here and worth discussing. And we will discuss these on Wednesday, the 14th, which is for me today. And so I hope you'll stop by and we can perhaps even have a conversation about, the transition to socialism. So let me thank you for your attention for this little preparatory reading of the concluding chapter of Lausen's book on the transition to socialism. And